Welcome to the slideshow on argumentation. I am your instructor, Cheryl Toon, and I hope that this PowerPoint presentation helps you to have a little bit of a better understanding about using the rhetorical appeals to write a good, strong, solid argument essay. Keep in mind, everything is an argument. And I do mean everything. Letters to the editor, persuasive debate, whether it's oral or written, expository essay, for example, if you're writing an essay for a history class. Even if you're doing expository, you're proving your point of the validity of the information. A personal narrative, a job application, a resume, poetry? Oh yeah, even poetry. Letters to the editor, for example. You may write a letter concerning the renaming of Highway 290 as Ronald Reagan Highway. You're basically arguing whether this is a good idea or not. A personal narrative. You're explaining and expressing your viewpoint on the role of childhood friends, most important relative, connection to your name, a biggest embarrassment, a greatest loss, or greatest learning experiences. Regardless of what your topic is in the personal narrative, you are proving your point of something that happened to you personally. Applications. Jobs, high school through adulthood. You are proving on that application that you are worthy to get that job. If you're trying to get into an honor society, you have to write an essay or you answer questions to prove that you are worthy to be in that honor society. The same thing for college acceptance. You are proving yourself. You argue your viewpoint that you are worthy to be accepted. An expository essay. You're explaining the merits or ills of Columbus. You explain the causes of Civil War. If you're explaining the causes of Civil War, you're proving your point. When you're proving your point, you're basically arguing. Explain the racial subtext of the adventures of Huckleberry Finn. You're explaining those subtexts. You're arguing your viewpoint. Let's take a look now at the rhetorical triangle developed by Aristotle way back many years ago. Aristotle said that in all writing and speaking presentations, there are three elements involved. You begin with the speaker, you have a set text, and you are directing it to a certain audience. So the speaker, the text, and the audience are the three elements of the rhetorical triangle. What is rhetoric? The art or study of using language effectively and persuasively. So if I refer to you in your notes, in my comments back to you, are you using strong rhetorics? What I'm talking about is your use of effective and persuasive language. Rhetoric may also be defined as the faculty of discerning, in any given case, the available means of persuasion. Using rhetorics means that you are strongly using all means possible and available to persuade the reader or the audience to your viewpoint. Aristotle said that when a rhetor or speaker begins to consider how to compose a speech, he must take into account three elements: the text, the audience and the speaker. The audience. The writer or speaker speculates about audience expectations and knowledge of the subject. He also uses his own experience and observation to help decide on how to communicate with his audience. As a writer for this class, you need to consider your audience. Yes, I am your audience, but also occasionally your peers will be your audience. So you need to take into consideration the expectations that your audience, mainly me, is going to have upon you regarding your subject and knowledge of that subject, as well as how you present your knowledge of that subject. The text. The writer or speaker evaluates what the audience knows already and needs to know. The writer investigates perspectives, he does research, and he determines kinds of evidence, format, style, etc., that seem most useful for that particular topic in that particular piece of writing. The speaker. The writer or the speaker has to stop and think, who am I as the speaker? What do I know and feel? And what have I, the speaker, done to find attitudes toward a text and my understanding of the audience? In other words, the speaker has to know what he's trying to say. He has to have done research enough to understand his topic or his subject. He must have plenty of valid proof, and he must also consider the attitudes of the audience and the understanding that the audience is going to have based on his writing. There are 4 basic appeals involved in rhetorics. I refer to these as the rhetorical appeals. These appeals are the approaches that influence the audience's attitude toward the subject. They are logos, ethos, pathos, and kairos. Logos allows the writer to offer clear, reasonable premises and proofs. Logos allows the author or the writer to develop ideas with appropriate details and make sure that the reader can follow the progression of the ideas. Logos, another way to look at logos is it logical? Ethos allows the writer to demonstrate that they are credible, good-willed, and knowledgeable, allows the writer to connect his thinking to his reader's own ethical and moral beliefs, and it allows the audience and speakers to be able to assume the best intentions and most thoughtful search for truth. In other words, ethos verifies that your information is credible, coming from credible sources, and is totally valid to the points you're making. Pathos. This is where the writer draws on emotions and the interests of the reader and highlights those emotions using personal stories and observations to provoke an audience's sympathetic reaction, and it also uses figurative language to heighten emotional connections. Figurative language elements using lots of metaphors, similes, personifications, lots of colorful, vivid language descriptions. Kairos refers to the timeliness of an argument. To be successful, it needs to be appropriate in tone and structure, and it needs to come at just the right time. Depending on your audience, you may adjust the timing, the tone, and the level of formality within the argument. How does this quote demonstrate ethos, pathos, logos, and kairos? My fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. Of course, this was John F. Kennedy. I want you to pause the video right now and ponder those 4 rhetorical appeal elements and see if you can figure out how does that one small quote contain all 4 elements: ethos, pathos, logos, and kairos. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. First of all, it calls attention to the ethical qualities of the speaker and the listener. Ethos. It proposes a solution to the country's problems by enlisting the citizens' help. Therefore, we have logos. It calls forth emotional patriotism. Pathos. And then it calls for a country united in its appreciation for human beings regardless of their race or social status. Kairos. Right in the middle of the civil rights movement. Definitely kairos. Very timely. Now we move to the context and the purpose of your writing. This is your intended effect on the audience. The context, the situation in which the text occurs. And then the purpose, this is the emerging aim that underlies many of the writer's decisions. Rhetorical triangle plus involves the speaker, the text, the audience, plus the context and the purpose. The context, the situation in which the text occurs, is especially important. You must understand the context based around when the situation occurred, the background information. This may reflect upon the important socioeconomic, the cultural elements, or the more mundane things such as where and when the text occurs. Some like to think of the context as the setting. As you break down the context, you may have to do a little digging and research to help you better understand the background of that time period so that you can understand the situation. Examples: a man painting on the sidewalk or in a museum. When is he doing this? What is the time frame? What was going on around him? What were the situations? If you're looking at Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, I Have a Dream, what's the context? Why did he give that speech? To whom is he giving that speech? What was going on that inspired him to give that speech? If you have a better understanding of the context, you will have a better approach to helping your reader understand what you're trying to say. Context tends to be more important when you're reading a text. You need to be aware of the situation in which the text was created. When you're composing, the context is usually less important because you're composing here and now, and you're aware of the context. There are always exceptions. If you're writing about moves toward democracy in the Middle East, but you live in the U.S., you may need to be aware of how your context differs from those who live in the Middle East, and that may affect your argument. In other words, in order for you to know something about what you're talking about, you may have to do some background research. Purpose, aka intent, is a tricky thing. I tell a joke, you don't laugh. Is it more important that I want to make you laugh, or is it more important that you don't laugh? Perhaps my intent to make you laugh and the fact that you don't laugh are equally interesting, but neither is more important. It is my not so humble opinion that one of the problems with education has been a focus on the importance of what the author meant when the audience's reaction is just as important. Therefore, I prefer to refer to purpose as intended effect on the audience. In other words, how do you intend to affect your audience? How do you want to move them? What do you want them to begin thinking based on what you're saying? When you're arguing, you have a purpose, and your purpose is to persuade your audience, perhaps to change their mind. The approach you take will determine how effective you are in persuading your audience to your way of thinking. There is purpose. This is not to say there is no such thing as intent or purpose. When you're writing, you must know your purpose. In an academic paper, the purpose may be presented in your thesis statement. And purpose can be clear when you're reading, as well as, if you think about this, all ads want you to buy their product. All commercials want you to think their product is the best. And if you have this product, your life will be wonderful. You're going to get that guy, or that girl will become your girlfriend if you have this product. That's what I want you to think about when you're writing your argument paper. You want to captivate my attention and your peers' attention, and you want to persuade them to your way of thinking that this is the way it has to be. Here's the final thoughts. Remember that the rhetorical triangle is not a recipe or a guideline for writing. It's more of a way of looking at a situation. A rhetorical situation is a specific given moment in which you use the rhetorical triangle +1 to observe what is happening. In any situation, by definition, truly, all parts of the triangle are present. Okay, now I want you to keep in mind as you're making your argument, be very, very careful that you are not critical of someone else's opinion. However, you do need to acknowledge their opinion in somewhat of a positive approach. You can say something like, I understand why so-and-so believes. However, I disagree with them on the point of, and then you continue on and make your point. Do not ever slam someone in your paper or slam opinions. Use a more positive approach, as I just did. If you have any questions regarding your argument essay, please call my office or send me an email. I want to help you become an excellent writer this semester.